In part 2 of our lecture on culture and globalization, we'll pick up with this idea of a culture region. A culture region is a bound area that shares similar cultural characteristics. Now, the boundaries of a culture region can be somewhat amoebic. They don't always tie into perfectly neat lines, as we'll see with a couple examples. But we can unite an area that shares a similar culture. Now, it's important to note that a culture region, it doesn't mean it's homogeneous. It doesn't mean that every single person is the exact same way, but rather it's a region that shares a similar cultural trait. When you think about locations like Latin America, right, that similar culture is a Latin-based language. For the most part, individuals in Latin America speak Portuguese or Spanish. But you also have Dutch, you also have English, you also have indigenous languages mixed in. But a culture region is a way for us to make sense of space by using a similar culture. And within our culture regions, we find a number of symbols. And symbols are generally tangible objects, signs, structures that tell our autobiography, that reflect our values. Our cultural landscape is a really important concept. Our cultural landscape is the way that we modify the area around us to reflect our values, to tell our autobiography. Now, if you go into town in Towson, you'll see a number of businesses cater to Towson University students. We also have a number of businesses that cater to the county seat, the center of local government. So when we look around, when we open our eyes, when we start to make sense of the area around us, we start to read our autobiography, and that's included in our cultural landscape. Generally, what these symbols reflect a dominant group, so a group in control, and this could lead to some issues with groups that are under or misrepresented. And when we start to unify these symbols, we create what's called a regional identity, the awareness of being part of a broader group. The image on your screen here is of Bar Harbor, Maine, and look at the symbols. You can see that you have a lobster shop. You can see that you have some boutique shops, another lobster symbol closer to the water. You have a town that's located on the water. So the symbols in this small New England town help create a regional identity, a town that was built on the seafood industry, a smaller community, one that has a lot of tradition in it, where the lobster men in that community have been applying their craft for generations. So when we have these strong regional identities, it helps people form a self versus other awareness. This is us, and the other would be a culture that includes different practices. Within our cultural landscape, we have this idea of a palimpsest. A palimpsest historically is a piece of parchment that has been written on, erased, and rewritten. And you can see signs of the past in the new draft. On our landscape, we include this idea of palimpsest to talk about an object that reflects its past. The image on the bottom right here is of a former furniture company located in downtown Baltimore. This furniture company was a viable business in the 19th and 20th centuries, but as the 20th century moved on and as these types of businesses got eaten up in manufacturing that was outsourced, this space was vacant. In the 21st century, it was recreated to serve our current culture. Businesses like Verizon, different restaurants, different offices moved into this building. While it no longer is the site of production for furniture, this place still reflects its past as its new use reflects our modern culture. When we look at culture regions, we usually define them on levels. So the core of the culture region, the most pure, the heart and soul of it. Think about the Chesapeake Bay. The bay itself is the core of the Bay region, but that Bay culture permeates into the Baltimore Metro, Washington Metro, Eastern Shore. When we talk about the core, we're looking at all of the traits that define the region, not just some of them. And we'll look at some more examples of the core. The domain is where the culture is dominant, but it's less intense, not quite as all encompassing as you would find in the core. And then the sphere, you find the culture or the culture trait, but it's a minority. It's not the dominant, not the majority culture. And when we look at these different levels of culture regions, we do need to recognize that boundaries are generally gradual. Again, we don't have these neat, cleanly defined lines, walls. Generally, cultural influence will either wane or intensify over space. This idea is considered friction of distance. As you move away from the core of a certain culture, you lose some of that intensity. The image on your screen here looks at baseball market areas, and you can see how the closer you are to the city where the team plays, the more intense the market area is, the more intense fan loyalty exists. So you can see, for example, the Pittsburgh Pirates in western Pennsylvania. You see that right in the core, the Pittsburgh metro area, it's deeper red, or deeper yellow, I'm sorry. As you move away from that, that color yellow fades a little bit as you get into the domain. And then as you go farther, you don't even have the Pirates fans, the Pirates market area as a dominant force. That doesn't mean that you don't have Pirates fans in Cleveland or Baltimore or Washington or Philadelphia. It just means that they would be the minority group in those areas. So oftentimes sports franchises are easy to adapt to this idea of culture regions with the core domain and sphere. The host city, generally the core, the most pure, the most loyal fan base. As you move away from that city or metro area, the team might still be the dominant team, but then as you move into the sphere, it's generally the minority. Another application of core domain and sphere allows us to look at the Mormon religion out in the western part of the United States. The Mormons arrived around Salt Lake in the late 19th century. They set up their home there, and as a result, that remains the core today. So you have this very pure Mormon core right around Salt Lake and Salt Lake City, meaning that most of the population is influenced by the Mormon culture. As you move away from the Salt Lake, that influence begins to diminish. And then as you move into states like Arizona, actually down into Mexico, into eastern Oregon, you see that you have the sphere of the Mormon culture. You have some influence, but it is the minority. And another look allows us to look at the former USSR, where Russia was the core of the Soviet Union. The Eastern European states, modern day Germany, the Czech Republic, Albania, these were former satellites of the Soviet Union. They would have been found in the domain. And then you also have places like Cuba, Vietnam, that would have been in the sphere. These little communist outposts that were found as a minority practice in different parts of the world. The last topic we're going to look at is cultural globalization. So bringing these ideas together. What happens when culture is applied to globalization? And we're going to look at some consequences of cultural globalization. The first is homogenization. This means standardization, sameness. And generally when we look at homogenization, we look at this through a critical lens. While there is certainly some benefits of homogenization, we look at it as negatively impacting local culture. This idea of placelessness, when our local character becomes standardized, meaning the businesses are all the same, the buildings look the same, behaviors begin to appear the same, we start to lose the unique identities that make places special. McDonaldization looks at the standardization of eating habits. So while places like McDonald's, Burger King, Starbucks are incredibly successful at growing their consumer demand around the world, we often see that the adoption of food from McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, KFC, Starbucks replaces existing unique local standards of eating. And then the third is Americanization. When we look at this mass consumerism here we have in the United States and how that practice, how that culture spreads to other parts of the world. Multinational corporations are moving to different parts of the world for sites of production, new markets, new employment bases. And we're seeing how places are adopting American culture in businesses and ways of living. This mass consumer society where we have a overindulgence in tangible items. Image here looks like it could be on just about any road, any major roadway in the United States. The image on the right is actually taken from Australia. The image on the left is a high street in Shrewsbury, England. And high streets are local main streets. And these streets all have unique local character with local businesses. But as we experience this cultural globalization, a lot of these businesses on High Street are going out of business. They can't compete with Amazon. They can't compete with shopping centers built on the outskirts of town that have these global chain companies that could sell goods at a lower price. So while the convenience of cultural globalization can't be overstated, there are also concerns. Another consequence is this idea of polarization. And as we become more standard, we also see a pushback with fragmentation, splitting up. This polarization reflects this intensification of local identity. You're probably familiar with the idea of buy local and neo-localism, this reinvestment in your local markets and your local communities. The images here show you, again, that buy local theme, that buy local ethos on the right. And also the image on the bottom left shows building standards that while we're allowing global corporations like IHOP and Home Depot to enter our community, when they build their physical footprint, it's going to be in a local cultural manner. The third idea is this idea of syncretism, glocalization, how products like Starbucks coffee, when it goes into China doesn't have a big demand for coffee products. So rather than Starbucks pushing its coffee line, it adopted to the local culture and pushed a line of teas. In India, this idea of globalization is seen through McDonald's, where the Hindu population rejects beef patties. So in India, they use a veggie patty for their burgers. The Peking Twisters in China. KFC, known for its fried chicken here in the United States, as it becomes a global company, looks to infiltrate local markets by adopting local demand. And in this case, rather than providing and pushing fried chicken, KFC uses duck as part of their Peking Twister. We have to ask ourselves, are these adaptations real or are they superficial? And that's part of the ever-evolving culture around the world. Globalization looks to be that nexus, that syncretism between local and global. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we're creating new, we're inventing new, and sometimes we're pushing an artificial product. So as you look at your consumption, look at the food you eat, like the image here on the slide. Chicken Parmesan is an adaptation of a Sicilian plate, eggplant Parmesan. While the chicken industry, chicken meat, is available in Italy, the demand wasn't that great when this dish was invented. But as Sicilians came to America and began to sell the dishes here in the restaurants, we adopted the Parmesan recipe, but added it with chicken. So not only is globalization a theme in other countries, it is happening here as foreign dishes like eggplant parmigiana is introduced in the America as chicken parmigiana. And that ends this lecture on culture and globalization.